Okay, I'm sure most of you have at least heard about that anime ranking video by the Anime Men that released in early September.
What the hell did I just watch? Goku with a tail? I've never seen that before.
I was one of them. No, I used to hate anime my whole entire life. Until 2020, the first actual anime episode I ever watched was the first episode of Death Note.
After watching all these shows, I was already super exhausted from watching anime, and this came on, and it was in freaking Spanish, so I couldn't even understand it.
But for all one of you in the audience who aren't aware, hi Dad. Long story short is that this group decided to watch the first episode of the top anime of every year from 1961 to 2025 and made a tier list out of it. It was very poorly received due to a combination of them having a generally disrespectful attitude towards the medium and being a perfect example of the growing trend of frenetic Mr. Beast style content that a lot of people are becoming increasingly frustrated by. While I do agree the video is bad, I'm not going to join the dog pile because I just don't feel like I have much to say that hasn't already been said. Also, they made a response to the backlash, and while their second attempt at a review still kinda sucks, they do seem to be willing to learn and improve, which is something I think should be encouraged. But media analysis is kinda my thing, so why not take their core concept and actually do it right? Before we get into it, here are the core problems with how the Anime Men approached their video and how my approach is different. If you don't care about that and just want to hear my thoughts on the anime, you can jump ahead to the timestamp currently on screen. The first issue is how they actually watched the anime. They didn't really pay attention, they watched at 2x speed, arbitrarily hopped between subs and dubs, and at one point they accidentally downloaded Inuyasha in Spanish and just watched it as is instead of taking the 2 minutes to find it in English. So I prioritized consistency and focus. I watched them all at normal speed, subtitled in English unless dubs were the only option, and actually paid attention. I actually did a lot of the viewing on stream, which was a lot of fun. If anyone's curious, I do have a playlist of all the VODs linked in the description, though some of them got eviscerated by copyright issues. Another criticism the Anime Men received is that watching just the first episode isn't really fair, and you know what? I agree. So did I watch everything to completion? Absolutely not. Fucking One Piece is on this list. Not happening. That being said, there's a common sentiment among weebs that if you pick up a new anime, you should give it at least 3 episodes before dropping it. So I decided to watch the first 3 episodes of each anime. Okay, there are a few exceptions, trust me, they make sense, I'll explain when it's relevant. While not perfect, I think it's a reasonable middle ground as long as we all understand I can only review what I've actually watched, so if a show gets way better or way worse later on, and I know that does apply to a few anime on this list, that won't factor into my ranking. The last major issue with the original video is that they never really explained why they gave things the rankings they did. They just kinda said, that was good, that was bad, that was skibbity riz ohio, or whatever the fuck Zoomer slang they used. So I'm going to actually have some loose guidelines to follow, and I will thoroughly explain my thoughts, so even if you disagree with my rankings, you'll at least know how I got there. So the primary factors I'll be considering are as follows. 1. Personal enjoyment. Quite simply, how much of a good time did I have watching the anime? 2. How well the first 3 episodes do as an introduction. Do I end up wanting more, or would I have dropped it if I was watching on my own time? And why? 3. General quality. My own subjective tastes aside, how well does it do what it's trying to do? How are the characters, the world building, the animation, the music, and is there anything noteworthy about the presentation that I feel raises it up or drags it down? And just to get this out of the way, this may be a hot take, but I strongly disagree with the popular opinion that the historical value or broader influence of the older anime should factor into the ranking. I think the idea that you need to basically give older anime bonus points due to their age is actively insulting to the creatives who put their heart and soul into their work. I believe in holding older art to the exact same standards because a lot of it can legitimately stand on its own without being artificially puffed up. But again, these are just loose guidelines for me to follow to basically keep me on track and give this video some semblance of structure, and I'll weigh things differently depending on context. Anime will be ranked from S tier to D tier. I'm not doing an F tier because I honestly feel like even the worst of the list aren't bad enough to deserve it. I also have an unrankable tier for special cases. It'll make sense when it's relevant. And last thing before we get started, the original list of anime is not completely accurate. Like, a lot of the anime they picked were not the most popular that year. I suspect they had ChatGPT pick the anime. But I'm not going to go through the effort of remaking the list from scratch. I'm just taking the Anime Men's list as it exists and working with it. Alright, we all on the same page here? Good. And by the way, since there's so many anime for me to cover, I'm not doing my usual deep dives here. If you want me to actually do a full review of anything in this video, leave a comment, and if there's demand for it, I might do it. 1961 and 1962, Otogi manga calendar or instant history. Okay, so I do have to address some issues with this pick. For starters, the Anime Men put instant history as 1961 and Otogi manga calendar as 1962. But the latter is just a serialized compilation of the former, so I think that was a mistake on their end. Also, I should mention that the series is literally lost media, like actually. Otogi Manga Calendar was a series of animated educational shorts for children, and as far as I can find, only really short clips exist. And they don't have any English translations available either. I did watch a clip of the show for the sake of completion, but because there's so little available to watch and no way for me to understand more than a word here and there, I'm not actually going to give it a ranking. There's just nothing there for me to work with due to it being lost media. Otogi Manga Calendar gets the unrankable tier. 1963, Tetsuwan Atom or Astro Boy. Tetsuwan Atom is one of, if not the most important anime, historically speaking. The modern anime industry would look very different than it does today without it. I have less experience with anime than most people tend to assume. In fact, I became a weeb through visual novels before moving on to anime, which I'm aware is very unusual. I was aware of just how influential Tetsuwan Atom was, but I had no real frame of reference for what to expect. I'd just never seen anime anywhere close to this old before, and what I saw seriously surprised me. What I expected was a low-stakes action sci-fi series that doesn't really try to do much besides entertain you, kinda like most American cartoons of that era. But what I got was a surprisingly ambitious story that touched on themes of identity and belonging. The titular Atom is a robot built by a scientist who was trying to create a replacement for the son he had lost in an accident. But of course, this isn't his son, and he ends up casting him out. What follows is a heart-wrenching tale of what is for all intents and purposes a young boy desperately trying to find a place to belong, all while bad actors prey on that desperation and use him for their own purposes. And here's the thing, while there was certainly some slapstick and absurdist humor here and there, this was mostly a very serious story that gets you invested in Atom as a character, and the silly elements do not take away from that. And surrounding this was a competent production overall. In fact, I was impressed by just about every element of this series. The art was polished and consistent, the voice acting and music were good, and the animation team actually managed to use the limitations they were working with to their advantage. For example, we all know about how some anime will either reuse frames or structure a scene so that they can get away with certain still frames rather than actually having to animate everything. Nobody really likes it, but it saves time and cost, so it just kinda happens. Well, I noticed that Tetsuwan Atom would often slow the frame rate down, duplicating frames on certain character movements, and the result was a jittering mechanical effect. But the thing is, they used that technique exclusively on the robots, so they saved on costs and made the fucking robots more robot-y at the same time. That's awesome! But it's not all praise for Tetsuwan Atom, because there was actually a really noticeable shift in episode 3. For starters, I actually couldn't find any subtitles past episode 2, and I really did not care for the English voice cast, but I'm not going to hold that against the show. But the overall writing just took a nosedive. It tried to jam way too much plot into the runtime, forcing the story to jump from beat to beat with no time for anything else. The deeper themes and ideas introduced in the first 2 episodes are seemingly abandoned. There are a number of moments that were clearly meant to evoke emotions but lacked proper setup. It wasn't painful to watch or anything, but it was a change and not for the better. But even with that disappointment, the overall experience was a lot of fun, and I found myself thoroughly impressed. Based on what I watched, I think Tetsuwan Atom deserves a solid A tier. 1964, Big X. So for starters, I couldn't watch the first 3 episodes specifically because media preservation at the time wasn't always a priority, and it appears most of the show is lost. So instead, I watched episodes 1, 11, and 12. Big X is a superhero show where a scientist working with the Nazis in World War II develops a superweapon, though the war is over before it can be finished. In the modern day, the remnants of the Nazi party are hunting down the weapon with plans of world domination, but it's now in the hands of the scientist's grandson Akira, who uses it to turn into a giant with superpowers, the titular Big X. So this seems like it's going to be a fun action romp, kinda like the common depictions of Superman at the time, right? After all, it does pretty clearly take a bit of inspiration from Superman in its presentation. Well, I didn't think I'd be saying this at all in this video, but the anime men were right about Big X, because this show fails at almost every level.
Big X.
Man, big dookie, bro.
Big stinky, bro.
But let's be fair here, it's not all bad. The animation, particularly during the action sequences, is actually very good for its time. I'd argue that on a technical level, the action sequences have better animation than Tetsuwan Atom. And also, in the first episode, they show Hitler shooting himself in the head, which is really fucking metal for an otherwise kid-friendly show. And some of the dialogue was charmingly silly at times. But that's where my praise ends. The pacing is an absolute slog, lingering excessively on individual plot points that don't actually serve a wider purpose. The characters are all completely one-dimensional. Their baseline attributes are their entire personality. It's like everything people complain about with old Superman, except it's worse because at least old Superman occasionally felt like a human with real emotions. There was generally zero action until the second half of each episode, which I normally wouldn't mind, except all that time that should have been used for setup and building excitement didn't actually do any of that. So you're basically just waiting for the one thing you actually care about, which is the action. And lastly, the series has probably the worst musical direction of this entire list. The tracks themselves were not bad, but with the exception of Big X's triumphant character theme, there was clearly no attempt to make the music actually service the scenes they're attached to. Music will cut harshly from track to track, some scenes just don't have any music at all for no discernible reason, and sometimes the track chosen actually clashes with the scene. For example, in episode 11, there was a scene where Big X is fighting a bunch of robot snails, and as usual, the action is fairly well animated. But the backing track is this ominous atmospheric hum, the kind that would normally be used to build tension and tease the audience with a hidden danger. So there's this slow but overbearing music accompanying this high-intensity fight scene, and all it does is drag down the tempo of an otherwise enjoyable action sequence. I'm going to try to show it to you here because you just have to see it. I'm going to splice a few very short clips together to prevent copyright issues, but it should still get my point across. So yeah, Big X was not a fun time, and I honestly felt kinda spoiled by Tetsuwan Atom because this was a fucking shock to say the least. While Big X is not entirely devoid of redeeming qualities, it's still just bad. D tier. 1965, Jungle Taitei or Kimba the White Lion. You can't talk about Kimba the White Lion without first mentioning the fact that many people consider it to be Japanese Lion King due to the many similarities the two share, including things like the protagonist being a displaced lion cub who grows up to lead his home territory, or how there are bumbling hyena villains, and even the iconic Pride Rock has a counterpart in this Japanese classic. Disney maintains that the similarities are pure coincidence and that they didn't even know about Kimba, though nobody really knows for sure except for the people who worked on The Lion King. Personally, I don't really care, but it's an interesting thing to note nonetheless. But what I can say is that while Kimba and The Lion King do share some similarities, they are far from carbon copies of one another, and pretty much everything aside from surface level characteristics and a few visual things is completely different. Kimba takes on more of an action sitcom style, with little small scale adventures in the jungle, with the good boy Kimba always saving the day through the power of love and friendship. And at the end of the day, it's okay, I guess. To be perfectly honest, the writing is nothing special. Not bad by any stretch, but it didn't really do anything beyond what I'd expect from someone who understands the fundamentals of writing. My complaints are mostly fairly minor. Some pacing and continuity quirks, some clunky dialogue, but nothing particularly crazy. I do think it's probably a good show to entertain a young child, but the writing just didn't really grab me because I don't feel like it was really trying to do all that much beneath the surface. What did grab me was the pure artistry on display. This is the first anime of the tier list to be in color, and holy shit, Kimba takes full advantage of that. To put it simply, this show is absolutely beautiful. Constant bright colors, very polished lighting and shading, establishing shots that are just fucking stunning to look at. There was even a decent amount of simulated camera work. While this is extremely commonplace nowadays, and you'll see it all the time if you pay attention, back in the 60s it very much was not. All of this feeds into the core experience of, wow, you can tell they really gave a shit with this one. And annoyingly, that makes it a pain in the ass for me to actually rank, because as a TV show, I didn't particularly care for it. It was fine, but nothing special. But I was captured by it as an exhibition of artistry. The love and passion that went into this series is on full display, and I think the 3 episodes I watched was pretty much the perfect amount of time to fully appreciate that aspect without letting it wear out its welcome. So how do I even rank this thing? Honestly, I'm still not entirely confident in my answer here, but I feel like I have to consider the fact that yes, the artistry on display is apparent, but once you get past that initial wow factor, there's not all that much else there to make you want to pick Kimba over all the other anime you could spend your time with. I certainly enjoyed myself, and I absolutely recommend everyone give it at least a bit of your time, but I'm left feeling like 3 episodes was the correct amount of time to have spent on this show, and I don't really have any desire to go back. B tier. 1966, Osomatsu-kun. Osomatsu-kun is another series that clearly had some preservation issues, and every streaming service I checked, all perfectly legal I swear, officer, only had 3 episodes available to watch out of the 56 that were released at the time. And I feel like that's kind of a shame. The core gimmick is that the family at the center of everything has 6 boys who are identical sextuplets, of which one is the titular Osomatsu. It follows the same general structure as a lot of the old classic silly cartoons of the West, you know, things like Bugs Bunny or Tom and Jerry. Cartoons that took a set of over-the-top characters with distinctive personalities and basically just plopped them into different plots and let them go about their antics over the course of a 10 to 12-ish minute episode. Osomatsu-kun is a very surface-level show, not really doing anything underneath the hood. It just takes a silly premise like having the boys buy a robot that gives head pats, the home getting invaded by a burglar disguised as a dog, or the little gremlin child leading a band of Arabian bandits. Don't ask. And just has the characters act in ridiculous ways that'll hopefully make you laugh. And for the most part, I feel like it succeeds in that regard. I had a great time watching, and even though it doesn't have the kind of deeper storytelling that I tend to prefer, it doesn't pretend to be anything more complex than it is, and I can respect that. I do have some complaints, however. The big issue is that I feel like the core gimmick actually harms things. The six brothers not only have no visual distinction between them, but they don't have unique personalities either, so each one is overshadowed by the other five. This style of comedy thrives on memorable characters, and it just doesn't mesh well with six carbon copies. Especially since they never even did anything with the fact that they're sextuplets. That in particular baffles me because I feel like there's a ton of humor to be found with six identical brothers. Why even have a gimmick if you're not going to utilize it at all? And aside from that, the animation was the most stiff and primitive we've seen so far. It doesn't really detract from the fun factor, but it is noteworthy since everything else I'd watched up to this point was way better in that department. And the humor, while certainly fun, wasn't anything particularly special. Again, an enjoyable experience, but you can find other cartoons from that era that did that style of humor better. I'd say the show is still worth checking out, but it's not something I'm itching to return to. C tier. 1967, Mach Go 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 or Speed Racer. Okay, so Speed Racer is iconic, super influential, and one of the earliest anime to actually make a major splash here in the West. You can't really discuss this show without at least acknowledging that fact. It's also kind of a trailblazer in many ways. It's also really fucking hard for me to rank. In fact, I feel like I could legitimately justify putting it anywhere from A tier to C tier. Let me explain. So for starters, there are two things that separate this series from many of its contemporaries. The first is that it's in color. While it's not the artistic spectacle that Kimba was, it is often very gorgeous. The second is that its episodes are not self-contained. During this time period, you couldn't watch TV shows on demand like you can today. You watched whatever happened to be on, and if you missed an episode, it could be months before you get another shot at it. As a result, most TV shows were made so that you could watch and enjoy each episode on its own, even without any context. Each episode was fundamentally its own thing. Speed Racer doesn't do that. Instead, it splits its stories into 2-episode chunks. The first ending on a cliffhanger, and the second resolving everything. While nothing special by today's standards, it was actually fairly risky at the time. I don't think the execution really did the job, but I can definitely respect the creative risk that was taken. But that right there is one major reason I find this show so hard to rank. As a story, the writing is fairly mid. It's an action series that half focuses on racing with the iconic tricked-out race car, and half focuses on conflicts with various antagonists, including a Bond villain-style evil organization. The tone is fairly inconsistent, with action that is over the top to the point of silliness that clashes with the occasional attempt at a more serious story that just never gets the focus it needs to really work. The plot beats themselves tend to be very formulaic, and if you understand the basic technical elements of writing, you pretty much always know what's coming, which detracts from the twists and turns that should keep you excited. But the thing is that despite all these weaknesses, the fun factor of the series is absolutely off the charts. I said that the action was over the top to the point of silliness, but I might be underselling it here. You've got car crashes left and right which always result in something bursting into flames. Cars go careening off of cliffs through the barricades which are apparently made of fucking paper mache with how little they do to prevent these catastrophes. It's just overall balls to the wall insanity, and it comes across as extremely self-aware. The creatives knew what kind of show they were making and were not afraid to really lean into it. And the action itself was generally well constructed, though I think they were better at choreographing and animating the vehicular segments than any fighting that happened on foot. So I had a great time just experiencing the racing, the explosions, the destruction, and the silly antics of the various characters, including a fucking monkey for some reason. He's just kinda there with no explanation. But the more I really sit down and think about it, the more I realize just how flimsy anything beyond the fun factor was. But I also recognize that Speed Racer is groundbreaking in many ways, and that the creatives took risks that should be praised even if they didn't fully bear fruit. Again, I feel like there are arguments to be made for anywhere between A and C tier. But I think I'm going to say that the highly entertaining action ultimately carries the writing out of C tier and leaves Speed Racer at a respectable B tier. 1968, Cyborg 009. As you can probably guess by the name, Cyborg 009 is a sci-fi anime. It's a superhero action series with a villain of the week structure. So self-contained episodes and a lot of spectacle. There's an ensemble cast of clankers, each with their own powers who are directed by a benevolent scientist, with the titular 009 acting as the protagonist. The premise is pretty simple. The group is up against some sort of villain or evil organization each episode, and they have to stop them from doing some over-the-top evil thing. There's nothing particularly unique about what this story is at its core, but there doesn't necessarily need to be. For the most part, Cyborg 009 knows exactly what it wants to be and delivers a lot of action that leans heavily into novelty and creativity. What I mean by that is that each action sequence does different things and you're never supposed to be able to guess what exactly comes next. So you might have a trapdoor leading to a snake pit, or missile launchers in the villain's front yard, or a fistfight with a Nazi penguin. I'm not joking, by the way, that's an actual thing that happens in the third episode. The core premise may be nothing all that unique, even for its time, and the plot isn't all that great either. But the show leans fully into delivering pure entertainment. One thing I found very interesting is that there appear to be two major influences at play here. There's superhero media, as you might expect, but there were a number of sequences that felt like they were lifted right out of a James Bond movie. And after a little bit of googling, it turns out that the original mangaka, Shotaro Ishinomori, did actually take inspiration from James Bond when working on Cyborg 009. In fact, one of the characters, 007, was made in part as an homage to the character. So that was pretty cool, and I had a lot of fun watching this show. The one major point of criticism I have is that the tone was not consistent over the 3 episodes I watched. The first episode was pretty much just pure action, with anything plot related serving the sole purpose of setting up another action sequence. It wasn't even pretending to be anything else. The second episode tried to introduce a serious tragic love story with an antagonist struggling with questions of morality and what it means to be human when most of your body has gone full Adeptus Mechanicus. That human connection element was symbolized by the persistent use of roses throughout the episode. It all comes to a conclusion that I won't spoil, and I don't feel like it quite hit the mark, though that's mostly because one episode just wasn't enough runtime. With more room to breathe, I think it had some real potential. But the point is that it's a big tonal shift from the first episode. Then the third episode is just so over the top that it goes into full-on silly territory. Need I remind you about the fucking Nazi penguins?
Heil Black Cross! Heil Black Cross!
The whole episode is that level of ridiculous. A whole lot of fun, but once again a massive tonal shift. While Cyborg 009 was very consistent in delivering crazy inventive action, it didn't feel like the writers were entirely sure about what type of story they were trying to tell surrounding that action. Granted, this was only the first 3 episodes, so it might not be a series-wide issue, but it did leave me scratching my head. But overall, this show is best experienced as a showcase of all the surreal, insane fun that old superhero and spy media was known for. The writing has its issues, but it didn't really drag down my enjoyment at all. A tier. 1969, Dororo. I'm just gonna come out and say that Dororo was the first anime to full-on floor me during my viewing, and to say I was impressed would honestly be an understatement. While I've enjoyed my foray into foundational anime up to this point, none of the shows I'd watched so far really scratched that storytelling itch, and there haven't yet been any additions to my backlog. Dororo changed that. This shonen series follows dual protagonists. The first is Hyakkimaru, a warrior who'd been dismembered by 48 demons as a baby because his dad was a dick who sold him for power. However, a doctor saved and adopted him and crafted prosthetics for him to replace his lost limbs, eyes, and ears, though the new eyes are not functional. The demons weren't thrilled by this, so now he's on a journey to find them and kill them to finally be free. And he learned martial arts along the way from another blind guy. The second protagonist is the titular Dororo, a young kid who fits that Aladdin-esque character archetype. Poverty-stricken and steals to survive. Kind of an arrogant little shit, but kind-hearted at his core. After a chance encounter, Hyakkimaru saves Dororo's life, and Dororo decides he's going to join him on his journey despite Hyakkimaru's attempts to scare him off. From there, the two wander and deal with supernatural shit. Pretty reasonable shonen-y premise, but the thing that got me is it was very apparent that Dororo took its storytelling seriously. Over the course of the 3 episodes I watched, which were a lot more slow-paced than a modern shonen, a lot of time was spent on making the audience understand what motivates these two characters and why they do what they do. There are emotional scenes depicting tragedy and loss. Both of these characters put on metaphorical masks to hide their pain, but you get to see behind them in ways that just feel profoundly genuine. Despite the overall sad tone accented by some light horror-inspired elements, I can see the beginnings of a powerful underlying theme of overcoming adversity and achieving greatness even when others write you off as a lost cause. Of not giving up even when the universe itself seems to oppose you. And on top of some genuinely strong writing, there's great sound design, phenomenal voice acting, and easily my favorite action sequences so far. So here's the thing. Back in the 60s, animators simply didn't have the same kind of tools that we have in the modern day. What that means is that the creatives would have to come up with ways to use what they had to bypass the limitations of the time. The example I gave earlier was from Astro Boy, where duplicate frames were used to simulate robotic stiffness. Well, Dororo's action sequences excel at making the most out of limited resources. The animation overall is pretty solid, but I suspect they just didn't have the means to really deliver a straightforward fight scene at that same level of quality. So instead, there's less of a focus on the blows and cuts themselves in favor of a strong focus on everything else. The scene at the end of episode 2 is the perfect example of that. It's a series of quick cuts that go between close-ups of Hyakkimaru's sword to blood gushing out of an enemy's neck or torso, to Hyakkimaru's face as he fights back tears, to a visual representation of his current emotional pain, all while this somber choral track plays in the background. It probably seems a bit weird out of context, but it works very well in context. On a technical level, this is not particularly impressive. In fact, it was probably easier to animate than the rest of the episode. But it sold everything that a flashy, well-animated fight scene would have, while also serving as an excellent look into Hyakkimaru's psyche. The story has only barely started as of episode 3, but I am so eager to return to see where they go with this. If you want to see what old anime is capable of, I can't recommend Dororo highly enough. S tier. 1970, Ashita no Joe, or Tomorrow's Joe. I knew that one of the downsides of how I'm approaching this video is that I'm only really going to experience the very beginnings of each anime. While it is ultimately a necessary evil due to the sheer amount of anime I had to watch, it does limit how much I can really say about each of the stories I've experienced. It's just not always going to be fair to talk about the writing without being able to see how everything comes together. I feel like Tomorrow's Joe is one of those times where this is going to be an issue, because having watched 3 out of 79 episodes, I can tell that it's still basically in the prologue. The characters are all still at their starting point, and we haven't really moved anything forward yet. I should probably set the stage a bit. Tomorrow's Joe is a boxing anime about a drifter, the titular Joe, catching the attention of a washed-up alcoholic boxing coach who takes him under his wing. It's made pretty clear early on, and I don't think you even really need to know anything about writing to pick up on this, that the story is going to be about not just boxing, but about finding your place in the world and using that newfound purpose to better yourself as a person. But to accomplish that, you need to have a starting point. And Joe's starting point is that he's kind of an asshole. In fact, I'd say at the beginning there are only 2 things that keep him somewhat likable. He's very charismatic, and he picks a fight with the local Yakuza clan who had been harassing a young child, showing that he does have at least some semblance of a moral compass. But aside from that, he runs scams, uses the people around him for personal gain, strong-arms people for money, and even does just a little bit of charity fraud. By the time episode 3 closes off, Joe had just recently agreed to start training for selfish reasons and is still a total dick. But there's a lot going on that makes me very optimistic. Joe's character introduction is absolutely stellar, establishing both the good and bad of his personality with very little dialogue. The individual scenes are all fun, and despite how the show can be fairly somber on the surface, there's a persistent undertone of hope that makes it just hit a little bit different. There are even some elements that I can tell are going to mean more as the series progresses, such as the tune Joe whistles to himself. That's a motif that has shown up several times in just the first few episodes. I can't quite say what it's supposed to represent, but it's clearly important. And oh man, the fight scenes are easily the best we've seen so far. Amazing use of an elastic squash and stretch to really sell the impact of Joe's punches, not unlike what you'd see in old Looney Tunes cartoons. So while Tomorrow's Joe definitely feels like it needs a bit more time to cook before it realizes its potential, what I saw intrigues me, and assuming they were able to keep that momentum up, it's definitely a worthwhile watch. A tier. 1971, Lupin III. We finally got big anime titties, S tier. Just kidding. Not about the titties though. Lupin III is actually noteworthy for being one of the first anime to contain a waifu. While there are definitely jokes to be made about how she is more well-endowed than the average anime woman at the time, and the fact that there is some fan service here and there, it is actually something that should be mentioned since waifus would become a staple of the anime industry, and that's something that's still going strong today. And don't think I'm saying any of this as a criticism. Not only does that kind of thing not bother me whatsoever, for those new to my channel, one of the things people know me for is fair reviews of highly sexual media. But I would argue that if the waifu wasn't a waifu here, it would have harmed the show as a whole. Let me explain. Lupin III is an action heist comedy with the titular Lupin being the grandson of a high-profile thief, think Mission Impossible type heists, who is continuing the family legacy. There are dual antagonists, the police with an inspector who has a particular grudge against Lupin, and a Bond villain-style evil organization. So basically, Lupin's the chaotic neutral who makes enemies across the board. The aforementioned waifu is Fujiko, who I can best describe as an unreliable acquaintance. There's a back and forth romance/sexual tension angle between her and Lupin, and she ultimately acts in her own self-interest, sometimes to Lupin's detriment. Oh, and she's the embodiment of the femme fatale archetype. And that's why it's important that she's an attractive, sexually aware character. Sexuality is a key part of the femme fatale because she will use it both as a symbol and as a mechanism for power, controlling the situation and bending those around her to her will. Lupin and Fujiko's dynamic simply wouldn't make sense if she wasn't like this. Also, there's the very clear James Bond influence that also leads to this being an expected feature of the show. So that's the anime titties explained, but the show as a whole is not all that serious, but rather an action comedy that mixes a Bond-style conflict against the baddies and a cat-and-mouse dynamic with the police, both of which serve to facilitate funny hijinks and over-the-top spy shit. Lupin puts on disguises, causes mayhem, and demonstrates a surprisingly balanced mix of suave and just falling flat on his face. Also, while Lupin III is not a fighting kinda show, they don't ever miss the chance to add crazy shit into the scenes whether or not it makes logical sense. You'll see cars explode and catch fire like Speed Racer. The evil villain tortures Fujiko by having a bunch of mechanical arms tickle her. And there's one scene where there's this bad guy who's bulletproof. Lupin and his partner shoot him with handguns, then Fujiko in the next room unloads with a submachine gun out of nowhere. And when he walks out of the room, Lupin has a fucking belt-fed heavy machine gun set up in the foyer of this mansion. Like a stationary defense machine gun you'd see in the military. It's just so stupid, and I can't overstate how high the fun factor is. That being said, there are a few negatives that do drag it down. For starters, the way the story is structured hints at longer-term storytelling that just doesn't seem to actually be going anywhere. Like they're playing off character dynamics that feel designed to be part of a larger whole, when in execution, Lupin III is definitely more of a villain of the week style of show. Also, while the music is generally very good, it'll occasionally just cut out for no apparent reason. I imagine they had something they were going for, but it just frustrated me when it happened. And overall, I found myself craving something just a bit more substantive than what Lupin III had to offer. It was a fun time, but I can only ever really see myself watching a couple episodes here and there. This is not a show I plan to binge. B tier, though right on the border of A tier. 1972, Devilman. When I started watching Devilman, I didn't really know what to expect. But a while back, I did see a few episodes of Devilman Crybaby. That was a gritty, edgy show, so I assumed that the original Devilman would be in the same vein. Nope. Turns out I was about to basically watch a Silver Age comic book, and it was fantastic. The premise of Devilman is that the titular Devilman is a demon from, well, it's never actually named, but basically hell. He's possessed the body of a teenager named Akira who had died in a hiking accident. His mission is to engage in copious amounts of fuckery and to basically be a supernatural saboteur. However, he ends up falling for a girl named Miki, which is also the name of my cat. That's not relevant at all, but I love this fluffy little asshole, and I think this picture of her is funny. But now that Devilman has an emotional tie to humanity, his new purpose is to defend her, and by extension, humanity, from the attacks of his former boss Xenon, who is basically Timu Satan. Over the course of the 3 episodes I watched, I could see a lot of foundations being laid. While Devilman's newfound allegiance is established very early on, there's clearly going to be a long-term arc of actually accepting human society as a whole and learning to coexist with it, as opposed to just valuing Miki and being a total gremlin to everyone else, with Miki being the driving force. She's a kind-hearted person, and so his attempts to get on her good side involve learning how people work so that she'll be impressed by him. It's still very much in its early stages by episode 3, but I'm curious to see how it plays out. While the episodes aren't completely isolated like many of the 60s anime I already covered, it does take on a villain of the week structure, with the antagonist of each episode being a demon sent to kill Devilman. The structure was pretty samey, though of course that's only based on 3 episodes. But each episode would feature the villain causing havoc, Devilman confronting them with some sort of disadvantage, such as an injury that prevents him from growing to his full size, and then eventually overcoming them as his theme song plays. And there's always some sort of lesson or character development peppered in throughout. Again, it feels very much like a Silver Age comic book. And feeding into that, the character design is fantastic. All the demons have wacky features and bright colors. I mean, if the story didn't already feel like a comic book, these visuals would get you there. The fight scenes themselves are great as well. The animation quality wasn't quite where I'd have liked it, and some of the blows really felt like they lacked any sort of impact. But the choreography was excellent and kept me hooked throughout. My main criticism is that some of the writing felt very forced, like they needed a certain thing to happen to set up the next plot beat, but it didn't always feel like a natural development. Like when Devilman out of fucking nowhere gets all overprotective of Miki, which drives a rift between them and creates the opening the villain of that episode needs to take her hostage. That could work, but it got introduced and resolved seemingly just to facilitate the plot, and it really felt like something the writers did rather than something the characters did. Overall, Devilman is a fun show with a ton of potential. A few hiccups here and there, but definitely worth a watch. A tier. 1973, Doraemon. So before I really get into it, there are two things I need to make clear, because I feel like I'm going to get shanked in a back alley if I don't. First, this is specifically the 1973 version of Doraemon, and not the much more successful reboot that most of you probably think of when you hear Doraemon. Second, it was surprisingly hard to actually find this one. Most of the perfectly legal streaming services don't actually have it. I did end up finding it, but it took a bit of doing, and the translation is dog shit. That almost certainly hurt my enjoyment, but there's not much I can really do about that. So with that out of the way, I did not care for this show. I can see the appeal, and there's definitely potential that I'm sure the reboot managed to take advantage of, but Doraemon 1973 just isn't very good. It's not exactly bad either, it's just basically the anime equivalent of eating a bowl of plain oatmeal. This is probably going to be the shortest segment in this video because there's really not much to say. Doraemon is a comedy about a child who gets up to silly antics alongside the titular robot Doraemon. Rather than full episodes, Doraemon is a series of 5 to 7 minute shorts, and the gist of the ones I watched were that Doraemon creates some weird outlandish thing and it eventually causes problems and then funny things happen. There is absolutely nothing going on beneath the surface, and while the comedy itself does have some potential, it basically feels like a worse version of other classic cartoons with the same style of humor. There's potential there, but I just don't feel like the execution really hit. C tier. 1974, Heidi, Girl of the Alps. I'm not going to mince words here. Heidi, Girl of the Alps is one of, if not my favorite slice of life stories. And yes, that's based on just the 3 episodes I watched. I am that convinced it's that good. The story is about the titular Heidi, a 5-year-old girl who's been dumped off onto her grandfather who lives in a rural village in the Swiss Alps. Her parents had died, and her aunt who was taking care of her got a career opportunity that wouldn't afford the flexibility to properly care for her. There's this little bit of stylistic flair the anime has that I find extremely charming. The show is ultimately from Heidi's perspective, and it really leans into that. Remember that Heidi is 5, with a 5-year-old's attention span. So there'll be conversation happening, delivering a bit of exposition to the audience, and halfway through, Heidi will get distracted by something and abruptly run off, taking the audience with her. On paper, it doesn't feel natural to cut off a dialogue, but it really brings us into Heidi's experience and seeing how she navigates and understands her new home. It's a subtle thing, but I honestly can't properly express how much it adds to the story without you actually watching it for yourself. The grandfather is the outcast of the village that people mostly stay away from. Now, I assumed that this was going to be one of those stories with the crotchety old caretaker who acts like a total asshole, before slowly realizing that the kid they're taking care of is adorable. We've all seen that a million times. But that's not what I got, and I really like this show's take on that core premise. See, Heidi's grandfather is kind of a dick, but not to her. He immediately takes a liking to her, and while he's not openly warm and loving, he takes on the role of the stoic patriarch who notices a hardship Heidi is experiencing and without a word immediately moves to fix it. She doesn't have a bed ready for her, he helps her make one out of hay and spare bed sheets. She can't reach the table for dinner, he builds her a stool. She's exploring the mountains of her new home with the local boy, he pulls him aside and tells him to look out for her. He's not the old dickhead character who needs his heart melted by his new charge, he's actually pretty kind all things considered. He's just kind of bitter and misunderstood. And the story does hint at some of the reasons he is the way he is, and I'm sure it gets explored as the series progresses. But the point I'm getting at is there's really strong writing going on here, and they haven't even finished introducing all the main cast yet. I know for a fact that a core friend group forms after the point I left off. It's not even finished with the setup, and it's already going strong. And on top of that, the voice acting is superb, and the studio really took advantage of the beautiful setting that is the Swiss Alps. Just looking at a picture of them is like something out of a fairy tale, and yeah, Heidi Girl of the Alps is visually stunning. Man, I cannot recommend this series highly enough. There is no question where this belongs on the tier list. Top of the list, S tier. 1975 UFO Robo Grendizer. I mentioned before that sometimes the fact that I'm only watching 3 episodes per anime is going to negatively impact some of the anime on this list. This feels like one of those times. This is the first mecha anime of this video, and right around this time is when mecha anime started getting a big surge in popularity. I'm sure most of you already know this, but there are a few tropes that are very common in mecha. One of those tropes is that in contrast to the bright colors and sleek designs that sometimes feel tailor-made for merchandise, these shows often had a focus on darker, grittier subjects and featured strong anti-war and anti-imperialist messaging. The reason I'm talking about this is that this type of story is one that needs to be properly laid out in order to work as a complete package. In many cases, juggling the character stuff with the actual high-stakes plot means that it takes more than 3 episodes before you have a solid idea of whether or not it's likely to succeed. Imagine you're standing in someone's kitchen and there are a bunch of baking supplies. Flour, eggs, sugar, everything you can think of. You can see that all the ingredients for a delicious cake are right there. But will there be a delicious cake in a few hours, or won't there? You can't tell until the process starts moving forward. That's kinda how I feel about UFO Robo Grendizer. This mecha anime has an exciting alien invasion, a rivalry dynamic between two mech pilots fighting for Earth, a cast of fun ranchers that break up the drama with bits of condensed slice of life and comic relief, fun robot designs with good fight choreography, and a protagonist who's an alien who lost his home to the alien empire that's currently attacking Earth, forcing him to battle between his desire to never participate in war again and his desire to protect his new home. All of that is good stuff, and I liked what I saw. But it's ultimately an amalgamation of good ingredients, and it's just too early for me to tell if things are headed in the right direction or not. Will these ingredients be used properly or not? It's hard to say. That being said, it was still a fun watch, and I especially enjoyed the antics of this absolute gremlin. In the 3rd episode, he literally pulls out a noose and threatens to lynch multiple people. It's fucking fantastic. But at the end of the day, how do I rank this thing? Depending on how well things play out, it could be an easy A tier all the way down to a low C tier. Ultimately, I'm just going to base it on what I actually saw. A fun show without all that much to sink my teeth into yet. B tier. 1976, Candy Candy. This section might upset some people, but let me first say that Candy Candy is beautiful. The visuals are great and the titular Candy's character design is absolutely stellar. One of the best we've seen up to this point in my opinion. Candy Candy is also a period piece that's essentially an anime soap opera. And I fucking hate soap operas. I don't know what it is, but that style of writing has always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it's the quantity over quality mentality that the live-action soaps tend to have. Maybe it's how heavily they push dramatic elements that I feel are unearned. Maybe I just prefer stories that have a destination in mind. But whatever it is that bugs me so much is impossible for me to ignore or look past. And I will fully admit that Candy Candy was absolutely not made for me. I'll also acknowledge that this is another series where, based on the summary blurb I read, the story hasn't really kicked off yet either, so there's definitely the possibility that it gets better. But that being said, I think this story has series potential, and I would have loved to see a series that was basically just this but more grounded, like a more typical slice of life story. Because the core premise is solid and there is some good stuff here. The story features a young orphan named Candy growing up in a poor rural religious orphanage. She apparently gets adopted eventually, but the first 3 episodes are all at the orphanage. She's kind of a little shit, but has a kind heart. I genuinely like a lot of the focus on how Candy deals with complex emotions before she's developed the maturity to properly process them. Like when one of her friends is going to be adopted, she's sad to see him go, but expresses that as anger towards him, which is something she needs to resolve before she sees him off. Or how her best friend Annie, who is her twin sister in all but blood, desperately longs for a real family, and Candy struggles with wanting her to have her loneliness cured and having that clash with her desire to avoid a separation, which is what would happen if one of them got adopted. These are great ways to start a character-focused story with complex characters that you'll really grow to love. But holy shit, every emotional beat is turned up to 11. Nobody's ever kind of sad, they're absolutely dejected. Nobody's ever just happy and content, it's always, oh, these are the best days of my life and I want them to last forever. The voice acting rarely plays out in a way that's reminiscent of actual human speech, but with inflections designed to overemphasize the core emotion of that line of dialogue. Like a soap opera or a telenovela. I mean, listen to how the various characters address Candy herself.
Candy! 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 Candy!
I get that there's an audience for this, and from what I hear, Candy Candy was extremely popular in Latin America. But I just can't help but feel like those elements detract from a story that's very strong conceptually. I honestly don't think I can look past it. I admit I'm biased against the soap opera nature of the show, but I just can't shake the idea that those very things that make it a soap opera are just worse versions of what they could have been. So you know what? I'll take the L here and put Candy Candy in unrankable, because I just don't think I can escape my own bias here. It would be a low C or a high D tier otherwise. So yeah, Candy Candy is unrankable. 1977, Voltes 5. Voltes 5 is basically distilled fun factor done to the exclusion of pretty much everything else, and it feels very self-aware. This anime is absolutely ridiculous in the best kind of way. It's a combination mecha anime, so 5 pilots who can combine their vehicles into a giant robot that they use to fight alien invaders who have their own giant robots. From the outset, this show demonstrates how insane it is and then just doesn't let up. Our 5 pilots are our primary ensemble cast, and they consist of a pistol sharpshooter, a judo master, a child genius who is knife fighting a shark in his introduction, a kunoichi, and a rodeo performer who uses his bullwhip for everything. Like, he wants to grab something off the table, he'll flick his whip at it and pull it to him. How do any of these characteristics make someone good at piloting a giant robot? Don't fucking worry about it, that's how. On paper, the writing of Voltes 5 is bad. The defining character traits of the main cast don't contribute anything to their personalities or to the wider story. The plot beats don't always make logical sense. There's interpersonal conflicts that feel very forced, and they escalate extraordinarily quickly due to how much one character instigates things to an unnatural degree. Under normal circumstances, I'd be complaining about these kind of things, but I think in this case it's 100% deliberate. The people who worked on Voltes 5 knew exactly what kind of show they were making, and they basically said, "We're making Rule of Cool the anime, fuck everything else." The titular Voltes 5 robot takes off a metal belt and uses it to launch giant Beyblades at the enemies? Sounds about right. The alien mothership is this big-ass demon skull with a castle on top? Yep. Robots explode when they're cut into pieces? Absolutely. One character's mother does a kamikaze attack against an alien robot, which leads to a reveal that a different character's mother had saved him by doing a suicide bombing against a pack of wolves? Why wouldn't it happen exactly that way? If I were to talk to any significant degree about the writing, the characters, the themes, I would be treating this show unfairly, and I'm not even kidding. Voltes 5 is fucking insane, and is clearly meant to be experienced as such. I'm usually the kind of person who likes deeper storytelling that really digs into how complex characters deal with various situations. But I appreciate the hell out of Voltes 5's outright rejection of that mindset. It's all crazy action, tropes turned up to 11, and it'll unapologetically insert things into the story just because they're cool. Don't go in expecting a conventionally good story, but absolutely expect to have a good time. This is wild. I'm glad I watched this. A tier. 1978. Mirai Shonen Conan or Future Boy Conan. Future Boy Conan is the first anime on this list to be set in full-on post-apocalyptic version of our world. In the story, the civilizations of the world had been destroyed in 2008 by supermagnetic weapons, which are apparently the next step up from nukes. And I think this is as good a time as any to mention something. I'd never realized this before I started watching the anime for this video, but it makes total sense in hindsight. A shitload of anime, especially older anime, featured some sort of super weapon that would support anti-war themes in the stories. I feel kinda dumb for not noticing this, but a lot of these are direct allegories to nuclear weapons. Makes a whole lot of sense when you think about how the people who worked on these anime in the 1970s pretty much all grew up in post-World War II Japan, which, as I'm sure you all know, was brought about by the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So of fucking course, once the kids of that era grew up, that would make its way into the art they created. It happens in a ton of anime around this time period, so it's worth mentioning. But in any case, Future Boy Conan is an adventure story in this post-apocalyptic setting. The quick version is that a young boy, the titular Conan, and an older man live alone on an island. No, not that island. They meet a young girl who's being chased by the military of an authoritarian country called Industria, which, by the way, is the first evidence they have of any other living humans on the planet. Industria finds the girl and takes her, the old man dies, and Conan goes off to find her. So here's the thing, like many other anime I've covered in this video already, Future Boy Conan is still kind of in the middle of setting up the story as of episode 3, so I can't definitively say if the seeds I'm seeing planted here are actually going to bear fruit. But what I can say is that what I'm seeing gives me a lot of hope for the remaining 73 episodes. While the series does seem to be establishing some fairly heavy underlying themes, and the driving plotline is not exactly a happy one so far, the minute-to-minute is generally pretty lighthearted. There's a lot of scenes of adventure and excitement. The opening scene is an extended sequence of Conan hunting a shark, though there's no real sense of danger. There are scenes of slapstick humor. When Conan meets another boy his age, there's a charming and funny scene of them trying to one-up each other until they get it out of their systems and become friends. But when it's time for serious emotion, the show treats it with the gravitas it needs to do character development via raw emotion. The scene of Conan struggling to process the grief of losing the man who raised him is honestly one of the most powerful individual scenes of the list so far. And on top of all of this other great stuff, I can see the seeds of a really intriguing underlying theme of how different generations feel about their broken and scarred world. The older generation exudes sadness and lament the loss of what they had. The young adults who were children when the world ended are bitter and resentful that their bright futures were stolen from them. And meanwhile, those born after the calamity embody hope and happiness. They don't even realize things are supposed to suck because it's all they know. So they appreciate the small joys they have and make the best of things without complaint. This was very cleanly established, and when I eventually go back to this show, because yes, it's absolutely going on the backlog, I can't wait to see how these ideas are explored. Again, I haven't even really fully finished the introductory phase of Future Boy Conan, but there's still some strong writing already, and I could tell that the writers knew what they were doing, and honestly, I think I'm more than comfortable putting Future Boy Conan up in S tier. 1979, Mobile Suit Gundam. The Gundam series is undeniably iconic. I mean shit, if you're into the Gunpla hobby, you'll know that people will straight up call them Gundams, even if they're from an entirely different IP. It's a staple of the mecha genre. That being said, I think for the purposes of this video, it's suffering from the same issues as UFO Robo Grendizer. There's a lot of good stuff I'm seeing that needs to cook more before I can properly evaluate it. The premise is simple but interesting. Humanity has been colonizing space, one of the colonies, Zeon, declares independence and starts a war with Earth. The interesting part is that the main cast got caught up in a surprise attack from Zeon, and the group that manages to escape on the military spacecraft is made up primarily of rookie soldiers and civilians, though they do happen to have the titular Gundam, a more powerful variant of the mech suits currently in use. The commander is seriously injured and can only serve a limited advisory role, and pretty much every experienced crew member and pilot either never made it onto the ship or are just dead. What intrigues me about this is that it kind of flips the typical power dynamics of this type of story. What you usually see is the underdog protagonists using their superior skills to face off against the much more well-equipped evil empire that doesn't have that same level of skill. However, here we have the exact opposite. The protagonists have the Gundam, an overpowered mech suit, or mobile suit as they call them. However, it's piloted by the protagonist Amuro, who has no experience with mobile suits before he gets a hold of it. And he's backed up by a group of people who also have no idea what they're doing in regards to tactics because they just haven't had a chance to learn. Contrast that with the antagonist Char, who I'm reasonably certain is an homage to the fucking Red Baron, the best fighter pilot in World War I. His mobile suit is vastly inferior to the Gundam, but he's one of the best combat pilots out there. They're only just setting all this up, but I am very intrigued. But sadly, all 3 episodes were dedicated to setting this whole scenario up, and there wasn't really any time to explore these ideas or to develop any of the characters in any kind of meaningful way. So I'm liking what I'm seeing, and it's a great introduction to the show, but everything else so far is still just underbaked at this point. So I'm giving Mobile Suit Gundam a B tier ranking, though with the caveat that this rank would absolutely rise if all this setup gets a satisfying payoff. 1980, Space Runaway Ideon. We've got another combination mecha anime on our hands, and like Mobile Suit Gundam and UFO Robo Grendizer, Space Runaway Ideon is still in the middle of setting things up as of episode 3, and as a result there's just not a whole lot for me to work with. So the basic premise is that we're not actually on Earth, but on a planet called Solo, which had recently been colonized. The colony is attacked by the natives who are known as the Buff Clan, and the robot du jour is a relic that had been found and restored by the researchers on the planet. The rest of the first 3 episodes can be loosely summed up as the Earthlings scrambling to organize a defense and gather up civilians in the wake of this surprise assault. They were caught off guard, so the clusterfuckery is still ongoing. Things are complicated a bit by Karala, who is for all intents and purposes the Buff Clan princess. She ran away from the Buff Clan for as yet unknown reasons, and they're searching for her. She doesn't appear hostile to the Earthlings, but also doesn't seem to be fully on their side either. Again, still early, but it's something new added to the formula. So to be clear, I wasn't bored when watching the show because the first 3 episodes pretty much got straight to the action and never let up, so it was engaging. But we only got the tiniest bit of any of these characters, baseline personality traits at most. Technically speaking, a lot happened in these first 3 episodes, but structurally not so much. It was all just everyone desperately trying to get their shit together to respond to the attack, so I'm left without all that much to go on. Though one thing I will say is that I actually really like how the Buff Clan appear human except for unnaturally colored eyes. It allows for easy visual identification while also allowing characters to mistake them for Earthlings and having that make sense. The animation was pretty good as well, and I think most everything was solid on a technical level. But still, there's just not that much there yet, so it's hard for me to really talk about the writing at all. I don't know, at this point there isn't even really anything making it stand out from the other mecha anime I've already covered. Grendizer had fun, unique characters and set up some conflicts that'll likely be explored later on. Gundam has a really exciting antagonist and an interesting dynamic of the protagonist having no idea what the fuck they're doing. Voltes 5 is just batshit insane. Ideon doesn't have anything setting it apart at this point. Could that change over the remaining 36 episodes? Absolutely. Hell, it probably does. But I can't judge the show based on what I speculate that it might be. I can only judge it on what I can see. And what I can see is a kind of middle of the road at the moment. It doesn't have any significant failings, but also nothing particularly noteworthy about it. Especially amidst a sea of mecha anime. Don't forget that mecha was booming at the time. So based on the first 3 episodes, I have to give Space Runaway Ideon a C tier. It probably gets better, but it just hasn't yet. 1981, Urusei Yatsura. How have I never seen this show before? Urusei Yatsura is an absurdist comedy that's technically ecchi due to a nip slip in the first episode, and if you've seen some of the games I've reviewed on this channel, you'll know full well that dumb sexy humor is right up my alley. This flavor of brain rot speaks to me on a spiritual level. The premise is that our protagonist Ataru is what can only be described as a horny dumbass. Not a fucking word out of any of you. An alien Oni species had decided to invade Earth, but instead of a full-on war, Ataru was randomly selected to duel the Oni princess Lum. Though instead of combat, he's given a time limit to grab onto her horns. He wins through trickery, and due to a misunderstanding, Lum believes that they are now engaged, which leads to a comical love triangle between her and Ataru's girlfriend. Hilarious hijinks ensue. And when I say hilarious, I mean this shit is fucking hilarious. Granted, this style of comedy is kinda my thing, but I think that most of you would probably agree with me here. Despite the somewhat convoluted premise, the core of what this show is actually surprisingly simple, and in my opinion, just about the perfect foundation for an outrageous comedy. There are 3 primary characters with over-the-top personalities that all complement the main dynamic of the show. Ataru is, as I said, a horny dumbass. He is very sex-brained, and that leads to situations where, let's just say he doesn't have enough blood to sustain both his upper brain and lower brain at the same time. Then there's Lum, who is very lovable but also a complete ditz. Her outward displays of affection and continual misinterpretations of her circumstances cause her to consistently escalate things just in general. And on top of that, she has a lot of power, both with her strength and ability to zap the shit out of Ataru whenever he pisses her off, and in having practically infinite resources at her disposal. This makes it pretty much impossible for anyone to directly contradict her understanding of things. And lastly, we've got Shinobu, Ataru's girlfriend. She is not happy about the situation and will regularly hulk the fuck out at Ataru for his degeneracy and for the whole situation with Lum. She's got that chihuahua energy going on. And in the first episode, Ataru is basically forced to agree to let Lum live with him and his family, which puts the 3 in close proximity even more than before. And here's the thing, this 3-way dynamic just exudes comedic potential. These are 3 high-energy personalities with conflicting motivations that all handle conflict and challenge differently. And of course, circumstances are such that conflict is inevitable. With competent writers, that right there is all you need as a baseline. All you have to do is keep putting these great characters into different situations and just let them rip. And that's exactly what Urusei Yatsura does. Something batshit crazy will happen, and the episode centers around these insane characters navigating it. Like when Lum's cousin, who was an adult who looks like a baby and plays the part when it suits him, feeds a bird some super nutrient pellets that turn it into a penguin. Don't question it, you'll just hurt yourself. Then he feeds it more and the penguin basically becomes a kaiju, because of course. And the entire episode is just the chaos of this dumb fuckery. The penguin eats everyone's lunch and eventually causes an accident leading to actual penguins getting free. The military is called at one point. Any stupid idea you can come up with happens. And it's all fantastic. It's pure comedy for the sake of comedy, and it works. I know I'm usually all about the deep character stuff and complex plots and crazy technical writing and all that shit. I mean, I've gone on some nerdy-ass writing rants in the past. But Urusei Yatsura doesn't have any of that. Its focus is solely and proudly on the comedy, and I can appreciate that all it wants to do is entertain you and make you laugh. And I think it succeeds in that regard. It is everything it wants to be, and for anyone who likes comedy packed to the brim with anime bullshit, this is a must-watch. S tier. 1982, Super Dimension Fortress Macross. I want to start out by saying that I genuinely have a lot of respect for this anime. It helped push the mecha genre in a new direction, and based on my research, it really pushed the envelope in many ways. That being said, based solely on the first 3 episodes, I really just do not care for this show. Part of the reason is the same thing we've been seeing with most of the mecha anime so far. It's still kind of in its setup phase where nearly all the focus is on moving the plot to square one, and there's just none of the character work I'd like to see to make me actually care about the cast. And if I'm being totally honest, I watched multiple anime in short succession where the first 3 episodes are basically aliens attack humans, 3 episodes are spent recovering and building a launch pad for the wider story. I'd gotten pretty burned out of seeing this exact story structure play out time after time. Of course, there are 133 episodes after the point I left off, so I'm sure there is more of what I like later on. But again, I do think it's a bit of a problem when a TV show expects you to watch multiple episodes before you actually start to give a shit about any of the characters. Of course, it's not all negatives, and I could see some of the seeds of what they're planting. There's this really black-pilled commander that's like morbidly impressed with the aliens, and he seems like he's gonna be fun. They're establishing a solid level of banter between the civilian protagonist and his military buddy. The action is quite well animated in my opinion, sleek mechanical sequences and tons of explosions. And in particular, I like how the show handles mech suits differently. Rather than being the combination superweapons of prior mecha anime, the mech suits in Macross transform between robots and fighter jets, which is cool. And rather than being this OP relic that functions as their only real chance of victory, they're basically just another war machine. Expensive, yes, but losing one is no more of an issue than using a fighter jet. It's just nice to see something a bit different. So I'm thinking that the show probably gets better with more time to cook, but despite the positives I'm seeing, in the first 3 episodes, Macross did something unforgivable. Granted, this is partly influenced by the fact that this is part of a mecha-heavy era in this tier list, meaning I'm seeing a lot of mecha in a short amount of time, but that doesn't change the fact that this anime genuinely bored me. I was bored watching this, and that just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Maybe it's just how I look at writing in general, but I just think 3 episodes is too long to wait for the opening spectacle of a series to give way to proper storytelling. Macross may be a great show. It was very successful and highly influential, so there had to be something there. But what I watched just wasn't that. C tier. 1983, Captain Tsubasa or Flash Kicker. Flash Kicker is an interesting case. It's a soccer anime that's still setting things up as of episode 3, but the thing is that it has a very clear vision of what it wants to be. While I can't say for sure if it ends up really capitalizing on its ideas, I can see that the writers knew exactly what they wanted to accomplish with the story, and that gives me a lot of hope. The premise is very simple. The titular Tsubasa is an elementary schooler who moved to Nankatsu City to pursue his passion of soccer seriously. You can tell he's really into soccer because when he's not playing soccer, he's reading a magazine called Sakka, which means soccer. The magazine's just called Soccer. He's originally going to join the prestigious private school with a really good soccer team, but ultimately decides to join the public school, because is it really a sports anime if the protagonist isn't a plucky underdog? That honestly tells you all you really need to know about the story. But when I'm talking about a vision, what I mean is that it plants a bunch of seeds for the story it plans on telling, and it's all very deliberate. There's a rivalry angle with the captain of the other school's soccer team, who is a prodigy goalie and definitely not Ash Ketchum. There's going to be a storyline about taking the public school soccer team and molding their passion for the game into the skills required to compete with their rivals. There's Tsubasa's live-in soccer coach. Don't ask, it's kinda convoluted even in context. Who is a former professional who retired for health reasons and wants to help Tsubasa realize his dream rather than succumb to bitterness. Each of these ideas is meticulously laid down, and it's very clear that the writers had plans for all of them. I can't say what those were, but it's a very good sign when a story's long-term implications are thought about ahead of time. Another thing I liked is the action sequences. The animation quality is good, but not exceptional. However, the backgrounds kind of fade away and the actual actions become slightly exaggerated, which is a great representation of being engrossed in a flow state and really sells how hyper-focused Tsubasa is when it's go time. That being said, there are a few weaknesses I noticed. Firstly, there are audio balancing issues. The music is too loud relative to the voiceover, and when the music swells, it tends to drown out whatever is being said. There is no excuse for a professionally produced anime to have this problem. None. Also, the story is extremely heavy-handed in its messaging. This can work in some contexts, but here it felt a bit like trying to make a sculpture with a sledgehammer. The coach outright states his desire to vicariously live out his dreams through Tsubasa. When Tsubasa becomes the first person to score a goal against his rival, the guy hits his head on the goalpost and busts his forehead open, showing that even he can bleed. We see that Tsubasa loves soccer so much partly because a soccer ball literally saved his life as a baby. Now, there's a possibility that all this stuff is so on the nose specifically for setup purposes, where the writers want to establish a baseline without having to waste any time whatsoever before proceeding with a bit more subtlety long term. Or maybe this is just how the story is. I can't say for certain, but I'm generally not a fan of writing that doesn't trust the audience to figure things out on their own, unless there's a really good reason for it. So overall, Captain Tsubasa currently has a lot of potential, and is probably pretty solid long term. Though there are a few problems I feel hold it back, especially those audio issues. Seriously, it's fucking ridiculous. B tier. Literally 1984, Fist of the North Star. I don't care how cringe it makes me, I was so excited to watch Fist of the North Star specifically to see the meme in context. You know the one.
お前はもう死んでいる。何?
That was one of the few anime memes I've known about since before I became a weeb, so this was significant for me. And oh my fucking god, it's even more ridiculous in context. Fist of the North Star is a martial arts shonen set in a Mad Max-style post-apocalyptic setting. On paper, this show is not good. The characters are flat, there's not much of anything going on underneath the surface, the plot is very straightforward, and nuance is practically a foreign concept to this anime. But it's not trying to be a good show. Fist of the North Star is probably the most batshit insane series I've covered in this video so far, and there's a strong argument that it's the most batshit insane of the entire list. The fun factor is so off the charts that everything else ceases to matter. The story is that the protagonist Ken is a practitioner of Hokuto Shinken, which is described as a martial art that damages you from the inside out. His whole thing is that he's hunting the big bad. The reasoning doesn't actually matter, but it's because the dude kidnapped his girlfriend. So he walks around fighting bandits as he searches for the bad guy. And in the first episode, he also acquires a kid as a sidekick. He's kind of a selfish little shit who acts as a decent counter to Ken's stoic and principled nature. It's going to be hard to explain why this show is so fun because it's something that really needs to be experienced to be understood. It is shonen bullshit turned up to 11. In that meme clip, he had just caused a bunch of bandits' heads to explode, and the guy he's talking to has his head explode right after, because I guess he had it on a delay for some reason. At one point, a bad guy shoots a crossbow, which doesn't even have a firing mechanism, but that's besides the point, at Ken, who proceeds to catch the bolt midair and throw it back in the guy's eye. Every episode, Ken has some absurdly named special move like Mountain Splitting Wave that he delivers to some unlucky enemy. Before he enters battle, he flexes and tears his shirt away. I don't know how he manages to upkeep his supply of shirts because he ruins like 5 of them in the first 3 episodes, and I doubt textile production is at full capacity. Everything that people love about over-the-top action anime and martial arts movies is present and turned up like 17 notches, and it's a wild ride start to finish. I know that I said that part of my criteria for ranking the anime in this video would be objective quality, but I think I'm going to have to make an exception here. Fist of the North Star is a fun show that's not trying to be anything but fun, and to judge it by any other standard wouldn't be fair. I consider this show a must-watch. I'm definitely going to return to it at some point. S tier. 1985, Touch. I have so many mixed feelings about this anime. I really want it to be good, and it may very well be good in its totality, but based on what I watched, I'm just not sure that it's headed towards proper execution of the genuinely good things it's setting up. Touch is a slice-of-life story, though it looks like baseball is also going to be important moving forward. The main group is the twins Tetsuya and Kazuya and their childhood friend Minami. They're all in middle school and all basically grew up together. The core premise of why there's a story is that Kazuya is the golden child who excels academically, athletically, and socially, whereas Tetsuya is content to just coast through life, accomplishing the bare minimum. Tetsuya isn't mistreated at home or anything like that, but everyone's hopes are on Kazuya, and everyone kind of assumes he and Minami are going to end up together and become the perfect couple. It's glaringly obvious to me that the way the story is moving, Tetsuya is going to develop feelings for Minami, which will give him the push he needs to get his shit together. All that right there is solid. Easy to understand core character dynamics that open the door to a wide variety of angles for the writers to explore, and a simple but powerful core motivator for change. And there are a lot of little things I really like about the dynamic between these three, even in these first few episodes. Tetsuya clearly feels a small amount of resentment towards Kazuya, who in return tends to in a minor way look down on Tetsuya for his lack of effort. But at the end of the day, they're brothers who love each other and have each other's back. And then Minami comes into the mix. She's very assertive but kind, and I actually like her a lot. She's pretty much the only person who really understands Tetsuya on a deeper level, and it's so clear that she's going to be the main one pushing him to be better. She can always tell the twins apart, even when one adjusts his appearance to more closely match the other. She doesn't take Tetsuya's shit and doesn't let him get away with things that others let slide. But she's also probably the only one who really believes in him as well, who knows that if he applies himself, he at least has the same potential as his brother. Again, she's looking like a great character from what I can tell. My issues with the show largely boil down to just how unnatural the writing, particularly the dialogue, tends to feel, and how in-your-face a lot of the messaging is. Whenever something plot-related is happening, a character will show up and just exposit the relevant information even if it doesn't really make sense in context. Like, there's one story that involves a popularity vote, and there's this one guy who just periodically gives updates on how that's going via dialogue, and it's clearly for the audience's benefit, not because it's something that makes sense in-universe. Instead of weaving the information into the dialogue in a way that actually fits, the writers just kind of said, okay, here's what we want the audience to know, make him say all of that. I'm not a fan of that. And also, the messaging is about as subtle as a brick through your window. There are good ideas here, but when they're shoved in my face, I don't get the full impact of what they're trying to do. For example, one of the key elements of Minami and Tetsuya's dynamic is that she sees his potential and wants him to succeed. She can be fairly harsh with him, but that's because she knows he's capable of better and she wants to gas him up, but not when he hasn't earned it. I fucking love that idea, and I think there's a great story to be told there. I just think we could have gone without the conversation that went like, when you look at me, all you do is complain. I'd like to praise you every once in a while, followed by a flashback showing a nearly identical interaction from when they were little, showing that Minami has always wanted to genuinely praise him and she's completely self-aware about it. To me, this shit feels like the kind of thing that should be revealed explicitly after a bunch of build-up and not just kinda thrown out there in the introductory phase of the story. It's like a character with abandonment issues just outright saying, "You're not going to abandon me, right?" at the beginning of a story. Looking at you, Julie Watanabe. If the writing is tightened up over the remaining 98 episodes, Touch easily has the potential to be S tier. If the writing stays at this level and this isn't just the clumsiness that comes with a new show figuring itself out, it'll still be enjoyable but oh so disappointing. So I don't think there's any real risk of a bad Touch, but it still needs some work. Low B tier. 1986, Dragon Ball. I was kinda scared to watch anything even tangentially related to the Dragon Ball franchise if I'm being perfectly honest. Not because I thought there'd be any issues with it, but because if I watch it and end up disliking it, I'll be declaring war on the entirety of Latin America. If the cartels figure that shit out, I'll go from making content on YouTube to being content on LiveLeak. I ain't about that. Fortunately, that's a moot point because I actually really liked what I saw. It is still definitely in the early phases of the story, and just from the limited knowledge of Dragon Ball I had going in, I know that they hadn't even come close to introducing the main cast as of episode 3. But even so, there's a lot to like about this show. The basic premise is that Bulma is a teenage girl on the hunt to find all of the Dragon Balls, which grant you a wish if you can gather them all together. She already has 2 and ends up meeting Goku, who has one of his own. Goku looks like he's about 7, but he's apparently 14. He lives alone in the middle of nowhere, away from civilization, and his whole thing is that he's a very powerful martial artist and he's got a monkey tail. I think I remember hearing that he's an alien and that's why, but regardless, he's based off of Sun Wukong. Even if I didn't already know that, it would be obvious considering his name is Son Goku. So the tale makes sense. They agree to travel together and proceed to have a comedic adventure. Emphasis on comedy. This anime is so much sillier than I was expecting, and there were dumb jokes around absolutely every corner. The characters are, without exception, some sort of caricature. Goku is an idiot who also has absolutely no knowledge about anything outside of his rural survivalist upbringing. This leads to situations such as asking Bulma why her balls are missing, thinking she must be upset because she has a butt on her chest, and attacking an airplane because he thinks it's a bird and he's hungry. Bulma is both vain and insecure, but also has a very fiery temper. The villain group, who hasn't done all that much just yet, are led by a bumbling moron, which is an archetype I really like in villains because it's fun. Goku and Bulma meet a wise old hermit who happens to be a total pervert. Everything and everyone in this series is absolutely ridiculous, and even though not a lot of plot stuff has happened just yet, it's a really fun time because of how insane it is. And then there's my favorite part. So as I was watching all the anime for this video, most of which was done on stream, it became a bit of a meme that I would constantly complain about the gun safety in pretty much any anime that featured a firearm. Specifically, the fact that anime characters don't seem too concerned about where their weapons are pointed most of the time, and that they always have their fingers directly on the trigger. Both of these are big no-nos when it comes to gun safety. Of course, I played into it and made sure to pay extra close attention whenever a character would use a gun to see how well they did. And let me tell you, what I saw in Dragon Ball warmed my little American heart. Yeah, there are multiple instances where Bulma just pulls out a gun and fucking unloads, and it never fails to be absolutely hilarious. Dragon Ball is a wild ride, and although I don't think it excels quite enough to be put in S tier, I think it's an easy A tier. 1987, City Hunter. City Hunter is a great show to highlight one of the things I've been talking about throughout this video. As I've said multiple times already, one of the weaknesses of me only being able to watch 3 episodes of each anime is that my perspective is going to be limited. It may be a necessary evil due to the sheer scale of this video otherwise, but I am aware that some of these anime aren't really getting a fair shake here. City Hunter is a great example of a show where if I only watched the first episode, I'd have given it a middling rank. However, it tightened things up very quickly. Kinda like how I imagine many of the anime I covered in this video improve over time, it just usually doesn't happen quite this fast. City Hunter is a mystery action comedy anime with the main character Ryo being a sweeper, which is basically a mix of detective, bodyguard, and assassin. His organization appears to operate outside the law, but also has a moral compass and doesn't take any jobs that it considers evil. As of episode 3, City Hunter's episodes have been pretty much self-contained, with one adventure per episode that's forgotten by the next. On stream, I referred to it as a waifu of the week structure, since each episode featured a female client that Ryo would be, interested in, though he never actually gets with any of them. And that's as good a time as any to pivot to a stylistic choice that I quite like. In a vacuum, the plot of City Hunter is generally pretty serious. The presentation is akin to a gritty detective story, characters deal with psychological trauma, the villains are evil but not in a fun cartoony way, The one thing that goes against this is Ryo himself. He's the one funny thing in this setting. It's not that the story itself is funny, it's that he's a funny person in a serious setting. While this is far from the only piece of fiction to take this approach, it's less common than everything being funny, and I like it when it's done well. While very good at his job, Ryo is basically a horny golden retriever. Kind of a fucking moron who constantly thinks with his dick. He gets distracted by every woman that walks past, creeps his clients out pretty consistently, and does a moderate amount of sexual harassment. This almost always backfires on him, resulting in a bit of slapstick humor, making these interactions funny rather than uncomfortable. So he's just this agent of chaos that does the whole action hero detective thing while also adding this layer of batshit fuckery to enhance the entertainment value. And one nice touch is he has this partner who doesn't really do much aside from introduce the jobs for each episode, but he's a fairly normal person who's just kind of used to Ryo's antics. And interestingly, when the two of them are together, they're basically a traditional comedy duo. Back when comedy duos were a real big thing, they were usually structured with a funny man and a straight man. The straight man would ground the scene, and any jokes they told would be deadpan. Like anything ridiculous they said was not them being ridiculous, but them acting normally within a ridiculous premise. Meanwhile, the funny man would be the one inserting all the antics, the emotion, the craziness. A classic example is Abbott and Costello. Ever see the Who's On First skit? That's them. If you haven't, pause the video and go watch it right the fuck now. It's on YouTube and it's a classic for a reason. Bud Abbott was the straight man who, as the name implies, played the scene straight. 90% of what he did was setting up for Lou Costello, who would just go fucking nuts and do and say silly things. Well-established format, and I love that City Hunter has a cheeky little nod towards that. Ryo's antics really do make the entire show, but now I need to talk about why this series grew on me so fast, and part of that was what I felt to be a general tightening of the script where everything just felt like it was being done a little better than episode 1. But the real improvement was in the women they would introduce in each episode. While episode 1 was a serious thing, the woman mostly just served as a plot device and occasionally as the straight man, straight woman I guess, to Ryo's antics as he'd sexually harass her and she'd have an appropriate reaction to that. Not unenjoyable, but nothing particularly special. In episodes 2 and 3, the women were actually real characters who were really going through it, adding a serious character-focused story on top of the plot-focused action comedy, and I feel like that really balanced things out nicely. Even though these women don't stick around, they serve as a great means of getting the audience emotionally invested in the plot and indirectly humanizing Ryo himself as he actively tries to help them through their difficult circumstances. There is still some clunkiness in the dialogue, and a number of plot points really don't make sense if you think about it. Like, one guy wanted to kill a boxer but make it look like an in-ring accident. His plan was to shoot him through the ear with a gold hollow point bullet so that the energy gets dispersed inside his head and there's no exit wound. Sounds reasonable, except there's still an entrance wound and there would be an autopsy. It's a dumb plan. In any case, there are a few issues holding City Hunter back, but I think they redeemed its mediocre first episode and it lands itself in the A tier. 1988, Samurai Troopers. Samurai Troopers is an anime that I think I would have absolutely loved as a kid, but as an adult I can't help but feel like it should be so much better. As always, there's certainly the chance that it does get better later on, but unlike some of the other anime I've covered in this video, it's not even planting any seeds I can really latch onto to give me hope. Samurai Troopers is an action sci-fi series where the titular Samurai Troopers are basically superheroes who have this special armor that they use to fight bad guys. And naturally, a bad guy makes himself known by invading Earth so it can be added to, and this is actually the real name, the Empire of Doom. You know what? Points for self-awareness. There are things I like about this anime. The character design is fucking phenomenal. The troopers and enemies all look awesome, and the first bad guy uses a flail as his weapon. Excellent. 10 out of 10, no notes. The music is also great. I found myself enjoying it start to finish. The fight scenes had creative choreography. They never really did the same exact thing twice, so they never felt samey. That's about where my praise ends. Now, it's not like there's a whole lot of harsh criticism I can dish out, because everything else it has to offer isn't bad per se, it just doesn't really have all that much to offer that sets itself apart from other similar shows. There's not really all that much writing to speak of. Granted, it's still very early, but the plot is moving at a glacial pace, and not much actually happens in each episode since about half of each episode is taken up by a fight scene. I could tell there were budget concerns with this show because there are a ton of shortcuts. Lots of still frames, cuts between points A and B with no animation between them, looping animations. For a show all about high-tech brawls that puts so much emphasis on the fighting just wasn't very impressive. Hell, you could go back 20 years and Dororo was able to craft fight scenes that were budget conscious and yet still delivered in spades. There didn't appear to be any real utilization of those limitations beyond just doing the thing because it costs less. It wasn't terrible to watch, it was just okay. But when half the runtime is these fight scenes, just okay doesn't really cut it because there are always going to be anime with bigger budgets that can throw money at a fight scene to produce a bigger spectacle. And on top of that, the character work is non-existent. We get basically nothing from anyone except their name and maybe a baseline character trait. Maybe. All in all, I didn't hate watching Samurai Troopers, and it may well get better, but what I watched was mid. C tier. 1989, Ranma 1/2. I'm going to start this by setting the stage a bit to get the idea across of what kind of anime this is. These two facts should get the idea across. First, the series opens up with a fight scene between a girl and a panda, ending with the panda knocking the girl out with a stop sign. Second, I had to stop watching on stream and delete the VOD because of just how many times someone popped a titty or two. Ranma 1/2 is an experience. One that I actually think has some really good things going for it. It's an ecchi martial arts comedy where the core premise is that the titular Ranma is a martial artist who is suffering from a curse, where being doused with cold water turns him into a girl, and being doused with hot water turns him back. His father, who is suffering from a similar curse, except he becomes a panda instead of gaining tits, has arranged for him to marry the daughter of the head of a different martial arts school. This girl doesn't like men, so she's not thrilled by this. That's the foundation. A little eclectic, but simple and easy to follow. It can't be ignored that Ranma 1/2 is very silly, and it never really lets up on that for more than like a minute at a time. And the gender-bending nature of Ranma's curse is often the source of that humor. The show will find any excuse to get Ranma wet. Not like that. And it always either serves as a funny punchline or causes a problem that Ranma suddenly needs to navigate. That's all well and good, and I definitely love a good silly comedy. But what I really like about this series is that what's been set up in these first 3 episodes has so much potential for long-term storytelling. In particular, I'm really liking the dynamic between Ranma and his now fiancée Akane. As I said before, she hates men, so she's not exactly the nicest to him, and they pretty quickly establish this mutual tsundere dynamic where they both push each other's buttons. However, there are cracks in the tsund very early on. There's a begrudging respect from Akane due to Ranma's martial arts prowess, and Ranma gets a degree of sympathy for Akane as well. See, the likely reason she hates men is that she's pretty popular, and every morning before school she has to literally fight off half the school who are all aiming to date her. And she does ultimately help him out with his condition when all is said and done. So while the two are still very antagonistic, they're well on their way to brokering a peace that'll eventually develop into some sort of bond. This is all strong stuff, and I can see this turning into a really good story. And another thing that was set up right at the end of episode 3 is a great source of continuing conflict and humor. The captain of the Kendo Club is the soft antagonist of the series at this point. He's a lot of fun because he's this edgy Kendo guy who always acts like he's in a samurai movie. Like he starts out by giving this melodramatic speech complete with thunder for emphasis. But literally nobody plays along, so it's just funny because of how out of place it is. And there are constant little nods toward that whole thing, including a scene mimicking a scene of the samurai dying in the middle of a field. Episodes 2 and 3 were actually largely focused on him. He started out obsessed with Akane, but ended up getting into beef with Ranma, so there's a bunch of shenanigans there. At one point, Ranma kicks his ass in girl form, and at the end of the 3rd episode, he confesses his love. So he hates Ranma's boy form, but wants to date his girl form, oblivious to the fact that they're one and the same. So that's definitely going to be funny. So early on, even though there's not a whole lot of forward motion with the plot or the characters just yet, I can see the setup they've done, and despite how much comedy is arguably the focus of the first few episodes, the foundation has been laid for a strong story moving forward. I enjoyed it at the start and was thoroughly impressed by the time I finished. That's another S tier. That's the end of the anime I'm covering in this video, but this is only part 1. I actually watched all the anime from the Anime Men's original video and was planning on doing it all together, but ended up realizing that it would be a bit much. And I really wanted to get this video out sooner rather than later. So I'll be covering the anime from 1990 to 2025 in the next video, which should hopefully be out in a couple weeks since I already have the viewing done, so look out for that. So with that, let's quickly go over where all the anime we covered today ended up. In the unrankable tier, we've got Otogi Manga Calendar and Candy Candy. In D tier, Big X is sitting all by itself. In C tier, we have Osomatsu-kun, Doraemon, Space Runaway Ideon, Macross, and Samurai Troopers. In B tier, Kimba the White Lion, Speed Racer, Lupin III, UFO Robo Grendizer, Mobile Suit Gundam, Flash Kicker, and Touch. In A tier, Astro Boy, Cyborg 009, Tomorrow's Joe, Devilman, Voltes 5, Dragon Ball, and City Hunter. And finally, all the way up in S tier, we've got Dororo, Heidi, Girl of the Alps, Future Boy Conan, Urusei Yatsura, Fist of the North Star, and Ranma 1/2. Thanks for watching. This project has basically been the reason I haven't uploaded in the past few months. 60 plus hours of anime takes time to watch, especially since I work full time and did a lot of the viewing on stream, which made it take longer. But as I said earlier, hopefully the second part should take no more than a few weeks or so. Big thank you to my members, especially my $10 members, Bulk Squat Thrust, President Irina Vladimirovna Putina, and Robert Lay. You've all been very patient with me, and I appreciate that. If you'd like to join them to get early access to future videos, you can join below for as little as $1 a month. Regardless, do make sure to like the video, subscribe for more, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully that'll be soon. Play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no